Before we dive into this content, I need to ask you a question. One of those that you can't answer quickly, nor with reason. What's your story with your father? Was he present? Did he leave early? Never showed up? Or did he stay? But even so, you grew up feeling alone. I know this kind of question stirs up old stuff, but take a deep breath. You're not here by accident. There's something inside that still beats. And maybe it's time to look at it with more care, more clarity, and most of all, more courage. What happened between the two of you? Or what never happened? Was it a silent absence? An obvious abandonment? A broken bond you tried to mend on your own? It doesn't matter if it was yesterday or 20 years ago. The impact of it often echoes through an entire life, even if we pretend we forgot. And today, more than offering you content, I want to invite you to a moment of truth with yourself. Because here now there are no roles to play, just the real chance to turn this silence that might still hurt you into something that can set you free. And before we move on, do one thing. Subscribe here. Not for the algorithm, not for the stats, but to keep this conversation going beyond just one video. Here we talk about what was never said. And I want to find you again whenever you need a space to think, to feel, and maybe to start over. And if you have the courage, watched even if just a little, share in the comments. What do you feel when you hear the word father? Write as if you're leaving the first trace of a new story. You don't need to share everything, but you can open a crack. Sometimes that crack is already light for someone else who carries a similar silence. We're going to talk about samurais. But before the sword comes the mirror, because there is no true strength without facing what shaped us. And if you stay with me until the end, you'll understand that your father's absence might have been unintentionally the beginning of the warrior you're becoming. Growing up without a father isn't just an absence. It's a kind of silence that clings to the soul and shapes everything even if you don't realize it. It's learning too early how to get by. It's holding on to questions that will never have answers. It's trying to be strong before your time. And it's above all living with a strange feeling that you're always owing something to someone or to yourself. The truth is, those who carry this kind of silence often walk through life with an invisible weight on their backs, a weight that becomes decisions, reactions, defenses. And when you finally notice, so much of what seemed like just your way of being was actually the result of what was missing. But here's a truth no one says out loud. The pain of not having a father can teach you what he didn't know how to be. It can forge you. It can refine you. And that's exactly where the teachings of the samurai begin to speak to your story. Because they too were born into worlds marked by loss, war, and absence. And even so, they created codes, not just for survival, but for conduct, for courage, for honor, for balance. What the samurai learned is that emptiness doesn't have to be the end of anything. It can be the beginning. They treated silence as a sacred place where the warrior meets himself. And maybe that's what you've been missing, turning the silence left by an absent father into an inner dojo. A space for building, for presence, for decision. Because no one chooses the lack, but you can choose what to do with it. So if you grew up without guidance, without support, without that look that teaches by example, maybe it's time to build your own code. A code from the inside out. A path that no longer depends on the story you were given, but on the one you decide to live from now on. Just like the samurai who became masters even in the face of pain, you too can be forged in the fire of absence and come out of it more whole. You may not have realized it, but that silence that came with your father's absence unintentionally became the place where many things were built inside you. It's there, in that nameless emptiness, that your fears were born, your way of protecting yourself, your difficulty in trusting, your habit of handling everything alone. The absence wasn't just a hole, it was a kind of school, but a tough school, one that didn't warn you it was teaching. You grew up trying to manage, trying to prove yourself, without knowing you were carrying a dojo in your chest. Yes, a dojo, like the samurai had, a space of constant training, invisible, silent, where pain becomes strength, where lack becomes inner presence. That's where the true warrior is born. Not in the scream, but in the silence. Not in confrontation with the world, but in facing oneself. Those who had a present father may have learned by observation, but those who didn't had to learn by feeling. And that, as unfair as it seems, can lead to a deeper awareness if you're willing to look within. The samurai knew this. They understood silence as a tool for refinement. The dojo wasn't just a physical place, it was a state of mind, a space of discipline, repetition, and listening. There, the warrior was not confronted by enemies, but by himself, by his impatience, by his impulsiveness, by his fear. And little by little, those ghosts would turn into clarity, into mastery, into presence. And maybe you, without someone to guide you, have already done this without realizing. Every time you had to swallow your tears, control your anger, hide your pain, you were inside your own dojo. Every time you had to get up on your own, make a decision without reference, care for yourself without affection, you were training. Hurting, yes, but also creating a kind of resilience that no book can teach. The question now is, are you going to stay in this dojo just surviving? Or are you going to start training with awareness? Will you turn silence into method? Because yes, even emptiness can be a teacher. Maybe you've never stopped to think about this. But that boy who cried in silence, that teenager who hardened to keep from breaking, that adult who tries to handle everything, they all still live inside you, and they're all asking for the same thing: direction. It's no longer about blaming the father who didn't stay, nor about pretending this didn't affect you. It's about understanding that this silence became part of who you are, but it doesn't have to define you anymore. From here on, you can use that space as a foundation, like the samurai did with their inner dojos. There, they didn't pretend the pain didn't exist. They faced it, shaped it, and came out more whole. Your father's silence won't disappear, but it can stop being a weight and become a starting point. A space where you train not to defend yourself from the world, but to become someone no one will ever abandon again. Every samurai followed a code, not written in laws, but in actions. Bushido was more than rules. It was a path, a way of walking through the world with principles like courage, righteousness, compassion, loyalty, and honor. For someone who grew up without a father, the idea of having a code might feel distant. After all, when there's no example, every decision becomes trial and error. You invent your morals in the middle of chaos. You learn through pain. You react by instinct. And little by little, without realizing it, you also build a code, crooked, silent, sometimes confusing, but yours. A code that says, don't trust anyone, don't show weakness, don't ask for help. But that code, even though it kept you standing until now, might be what's holding you back. Because it was created to survive, and now it might be time to learn how to live differently. That's why looking at Bushido can be transformative, not as some distant tradition, but as a mirror, an invitation to rewrite the rules you follow on the inside. The samurai weren't perfect, but they were aware. They knew what they were fighting for. They knew what they wouldn't compromise. They knew what sustained their path, even in pain. And that clarity is what so many people who grew up without a foundation are missing. When there's no reference, any emotion can carry you away. Any criticism can break you. Any rejection can trigger you. But what if, instead of this inner chaos, you created your own Bushido? A personal code that reminds you who you chose to be, not who the circumstances forced you to become. Something simple, but steady. Like, I act with truth, even when it hurts. I care for what I feel, even if I never learned how to do that. I protect what I love, even if no one ever taught me what love is. This code doesn't have to be perfect. It just needs to be yours, aligned with what you want to sustain from now on. Because there comes a time when we stop blaming the past and start owning our own name. The father who wasn't there may have left a void, but that void also gave you the chance to write your own starting line. And now, with awareness, you can decide what values will guide your path, not to please anyone, but so that, When you look in the mirror, you know exactly who's there, and know above all that it no longer matters what you lacked. You don't have to live adrift anymore. A well-lived code is an invisible armor, and a conscious heart is the sharpest sword there is. There comes a moment when it sinks in. He's not coming back. Not to explain, not to apologize, not to complete what was missing. And it's in that moment that something inside us begins to change. The pain doesn't disappear, but it transforms. You stop waiting and start building. And that's when, without realizing it, what was missing on the outside starts to grow on the inside, as if the father's absence made room for another kind of figure, not the biological one, but the symbolic one. A master, someone who teaches not through physical presence, but through everything you had to learn on your own. That master is you, but in a more conscious version, more awake. He is shaped by listening to his own wounds, by embracing his own flaws, and most of all by choosing not to repeat the absence that shaped him. The hardest part is that this process doesn't come with applause. No one sees when you choose not to react like before, when you take a deep breath before acting, when you choose to care even without having been cared for. But it's exactly these invisible decisions that build the master you're becoming. A master who knows in his own skin what it means to have had no support, and so chooses to be support. A master who doesn't deny his pain, but doesn't let it define him either. Who learned from lack how to be present, who learned from silence how to listen, who learned from abandonment how to stay. And at this point, what once seemed like a broken story begins to reveal a rare kind of wisdom, the kind that comes from not having had everything, but building something worthy anyway. The samurai called this a spiritual legacy. It wasn't about blood, name, or family of origin. It was about what you chose to pass on. And maybe that's your greatest power. To end a cycle. To be the end of a lineage of absence. The beginning of a lineage of presence. You don't have to be a father to do that. Just be presence in the world, in your work, in your relationships, in how you show up for those who trust you. The master that forms in someone who grew up without a father isn't a replacement. He's a transcendence. He doesn't erase the past. He honors the path that brought him here. And with sword in hand and awareness in his chest, he chooses to continue, but in a different way. Because now, what guides you is no longer what was missing. It's who you've decided to become. Carrying the absence of a father for years can make you believe that it's part of who you are, as if it were a fixed piece of your identity. But it's not. It was just the setting where your story began, not the entire script. At some point, you need to take up that invisible sword knife placed in your hands and learn to cut. Cut the guilt for feeling too much. Cut the fear of being weak. Cut the attachment to a story that no longer needs to define you. And this isn't about turning your back on the past. It's about no longer being a prisoner of it, because as long as his absence keeps dictating your choices, your emotions, and how you see yourself, you're still fighting a war that's already over. The cut is symbolic but deep. It may be silent, but it changes everything. It's when you stop repeating patterns you don't understand, when you realize you don't have to carry what isn't yours. When you understand that his absence says nothing about your worth, that you're not less deserving of love, trust, or respect just because someone didn't know how to offer it, and most importantly, that you can free yourself from the need to prove anything. Many who grew up without a father live trying to show they're strong, they're good, they're worthy, but that only prolongs the wound. True liberation comes when you realize you don't have to prove anything, only live in truth. And yes, it's possible to cut that tie with honor, without resentment, without weight, only with clarity. The samurai trained for years to make a single cut, precise, clean, decisive. They knew that too much force gets in the way. That imbalance hurts more than the strike. That's why the cut was an act of presence, not violence. And maybe that's what you need now, a clean cut from what no longer serves you, an internal break from the idea that you are the result of someone's absence. You are so much more than that. You are the result of the presence you chose to build within yourself. The sword is in your hands, and it doesn't need to be used to wound anyone, but to separate who you were from who you're ready to become. Growing up without a father teaches you early on that feeling too much can be dangerous, so you learn to hide, to hold it in, to protect yourself. You put on an invisible armor. Don't show pain, don't cry, don't slip. You become the strong one, the one who can handle everything. But inside your body aches with tension. Your heart beats fast, afraid to fail, because that armor, the one that saved you for so long, starts to get heavy, and eventually, it no longer protects, it imprisons. Because no one really sees you. They only see the character you created to survive in a world where you had to figure everything out on your own. And behind that apparent strength, there's often someone tired, exhausted, wanting to be seen without having to hold it all together all the time. The thing is, the samurai also wore armor, but not to hide who they were. They knew their pain, their limits, their fears deeply, and that's why they knew when to wear the armor and when to take it off. Their strength didn't come from rigidity, but from balance. They trained to be present even in pain, and they understood that true courage is the kind that shows up when it would be easier to shut down. You may have learned that vulnerability is weakness, but in truth it's the opposite. It takes much more courage to say, "I don't know, I need, this affects me," than to pretend to be tough. Showing your wound doesn't make you less, it makes you human. And only those who allow themselves to truly feel can begin to heal. From here on, maybe what you need most isn't to reinforce the armor, but to start taking it apart, piece by piece, with patience, with care, with honesty. Allowing yourself to be who you are, with everything you carry, without shame, without fear of seeming weak. Because deep down, real strength is continuing on, even with scars. It's still believing in love after the absence. It's not hiding behind control. It's showing up whole. The armor got you this far, yes, but maybe now it's time to lay it down, so you can walk lighter, more real, more you. There comes a moment when loneliness stops feeling like punishment and becomes a crossing. The lone warrior isn't the one who was abandoned and left behind. He's the one who chose to keep going, even without company, even without applause, even without someone to call an example. You didn't choose to grow up without a father. You didn't choose to have to figure out on your own how to love, how to trust, how to be someone. But still, you chose to stay. You chose to move forward. And that makes you much more than a survivor. It makes you a creator. A creator of paths where there was no road. A creator of a new kind of presence, forged precisely in absence. Because yes, those who've walked alone for so long start to see far. And those who've learned to care for themselves are often the ones who know best how to care for others. The world needs this kind of warrior, not the one who hides his wounds, but the one who has already learned from them, not the one who copies a model, but the one who decides to become a reference even without ever having one. The new lineage begins when you understand that you don't have to repeat anything that hurt you, that you can be a father, a brother, a friend, a partner, with a presence that heals instead of demands, with a gaze that welcomes instead of judges, with a silence that listens instead of wounds. This isn't a burden, it's a mission, one you didn't ask for, but that you can accept with honor. Because when you choose not to abandon yourself, you're already breaking the cycle. You're already founding a new kind of story, a story where the absence doesn't repeat. It ends with you. And this new lineage doesn't depend on blood. It's not about being a father to someone on paper. It's about becoming a living reference of presence, of awareness, of care. It's about doing things differently, saying what you never heard, teaching what was never taught to you, protecting with the strength you never received. That's the most powerful legacy anyone can leave. Not what they inherited, but what they created from pain. The warrior you've become no longer needs to prove anything to anyone. He now walks by choice. And where he steps, others will be inspired. Because in the end, those who learn to transform the silence of a father who was absent become the foundation of a world that no longer knows what true presence is. Not every lesson comes from a present voice. Some are born precisely from what was missing, from the emptiness no one saw, from the silence no one heard. And that's where one of life's greatest secrets lies. Absence can also teach. It doesn't choose words, but it shapes actions. It doesn't give answers, but it forces us to ask. And those who cross that desert, without shortcuts, without guides, without a map, end up discovering a rare strength within themselves. A strength that doesn't shout but holds steady, that doesn't impose but transforms, that wasn't born to be anyone's shadow, but the root of something new. If you felt this text somewhere deep inside, it's because you carry something similar. Maybe an open wound, maybe an old silence you're tired of pretending isn't there. And if this content helped you see something that used to be only pain, now is the time to take a step, to turn awareness into presence. Be that turning point in your own story. And if you can, share in the comments how that absence has shaped you, or still does. Sometimes what you write helps someone else recognize themselves. And in that meeting of stories, the beginning of a new lineage is born. If you want to keep walking this path with me, with content that goes beyond the surface and touches what really matters, subscribe here, because those who carry an old silence don't have to walk alone anymore. And those who learn to listen to what the pain is trying to say have already begun to heal.